Well, hopefully we'll be able to record the lecture for those that didn't make it in today. So autonomic nervous system and visceral reflexes. Up to this point, we've kind of covered a lot of the rest of the nervous system. What's left is basically, some of these reflexes that involve the viscera. The reflexes we talked about so far, what were the effectors? So what were the effectors? So remember the patellar tendon. What was the effector? So if you had that reflex arc, where did it end? So the skeletal muscle, exactly, right? So it was basically going to be contracting the quadriceps and relaxing the hamstrings for that reflex. So here we're going to talk about reflexes that basically don't involve skeletal muscle. So what types of reflexes, what are the effectors going to be? Well, think about all those effectors that aren't skeletal muscle. So what are some of them? Smooth muscle, glands, those are the two big ones, and then cardiac muscle, right? So we're going to talk about how some of these other effectors are controlled. All right, so, starting off with kind of what we've seen when we started off our discussions with other parts of the nervous system. The CNS is composed of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, we can divide up into the sensory division, which has all those cutaneous receptors, thermal receptors, proprioceptors, and so forth. Also, we're going to talk about special sensory organs when we get into special senses that kind of drop into that category. And then the other part of the peripheral nervous system, the motor division, breaking that up into somatic motor division, the visceral motor division. This one we've talked about already. So somatic, anytime you have the word somatic, the effector is going to be, what do you say for the patellar tendon reflex? Skeletal muscle, right? So here, these guys, the effectors are going to be some of those other, effectors we talked about, glands, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Now, for the visceral motor division, you can also call it the autonomic division here. It's going to be broken up further into two subdivisions or two other divisions called the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And we're going to compare and contrast these two as we talk about them. All right. Okay, so here, autonomic nervous system properties, just like what we saw before, with reflexes, you have the same basic architecture. You have a stimulus that's sending information to some sort of integratory system in the central nervous system, which is going to send a response back out. In this case, instead of the effector being the skeletal muscle, it's going to be gland, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and so forth. All right? And so here, just as an example, so we have our heart rate coming from our heart. And one of the things that's going to be integrated in here is that if we have too high a blood pressure, okay, heart is a major pump for the cardiovascular system, so if blood pressure is too high, do you want to pump more frequently, or do you want to slow that pump down? Slow it down, right? So here, there's special type of receptors. So barometers measure what? Anybody know that? So for the weather, barometers measure pressure, right? So here we have baroreceptors that are measuring pressure in the cardiovascular system, so in the blood pressure. And so that's sending a signal. So if it's going towards the central nervous system, what type of pathway is that? Afferent or efferent? Afferent, right? And it's sensory information. And remember, the part of the central nervous system, in this case the brain, is taking in information that's critical for survival and life. Generally, that's housed in the brainstem, right? So not surprisingly, the center that integrates this and then is going to send a response back out is going into the medulla oblongata here, part of the brainstem. So you get integrated and it sends a signal back out to the heart. And like you guys said, if pressure is too high for homeostasis, you're going to want to try to minimize that pressure, which means you're going to slow down that pumping. And so here you reduce the heart rate. Okay? So heart rate decreases. So here the effector, in this case, the type of tissue is cardiac muscle. Okay? And so here we're going to, once again, remember back to homeostasis with negative feedback, where the original stimulus is, the response is to try to minimize it. So if the original stimulus is too high a blood pressure, then to try to minimize it, we would lower it. All right, everybody follow me on this? So this basic reflex arc is the exact same reflex arc we saw before, except here the effector is not skeletal muscle. All right, so are we aware of this? Generally not, okay? And so just like reflexes in general, so blood pressure is one example here, but there's other reflexes out there that are involved. Some of these overlap with the endocrine system. We'll talk about that, in a few weeks. But body temperature, respiratory airflow. So here, a respiratory airflow generally is going to go with one division, and the opposite is going to happen with the other division. All right. So here, why do we call it the autonomic nervous system? Well, it generally is having these effects without our intent. We have unconscious control over control of these effectors, unlike skeletal muscle where we can have an intent to try to control what they're going to do. All right? Okay. So the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, all right, is the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. In general, they kind of have opposite roles for each other. The parasympathetic, so maybe you guys have heard of this, is involved with resting and digesting. All right? So it's directing a lot of these activities we think about that keep us alive when we're relaxed. So like the way you guys are right now, all right? Maybe if you are commuting in, you may have been activating this other division of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, right? Or the last time we met, when you guys had an exam, right? Maybe this part of the autonomic nervous system was more activated than this parasympathetic, right? So here, parasympathetics involve the resting and digesting, basically non-stressful situations. So you can think about it as the D division, which is involved with digestion, defecation, diuresis. So does everybody know what diuresis means? Excessive something. Yeah, that's certainly true. So urination, so urine formation. So uresis, diuresis. Okay? So here, the other way is SLUD. So salivation, does everybody understand what that means? So saliva formation. So hopefully this is all somewhat making sense that, all right, if we're involved with digestion, we got to have increasing everything that helps with digestion. Saliva, for instance, and so forth. Lacrimation, anybody know what that means? So tear production. Yep. So tear production. Urination, so that goes with the diuresis. And also defecation. Does everybody know what defecation is referring to? So basically poop formation, fecal matter, right? So basically helping move things through the GI tract. All right, so all of those things, right? Parasympathetic, if that division is more active, then you're seeing a little bit more digestion, right? If you're in a relaxed situation, the dominant division of the autonomic nervous system that's present here, the dominant one's going to be more the parasympathetic, right? Now, if you think back to when you guys were taking an exam, or if you're out hiking and you see a bear, or if you're driving this morning and people are doing crazy stuff with the weather that's out there, you're probably activating the sympathetic division. So what does that look like? Well, it's active in stressful situations. So think about what happens in stressful situations. You kind of have hyper-focus, hyper-vigilance, right? Ready to go. And so here, this is excitatory fight or flight response. You can think about this as kind of the E division, where you have embarrassment, excitement, exercise, emergency situations, all of that, types of situations are activating the sympathetic nervous system. And so when you get activation of the sympathetic nervous system, it's generally going to do the opposite of the parasympathetic. So parasympathetic, when you're resting and digesting, right, when you guys are relaxing, your heart rate elevated or decreased? Decreased, right? If you're out hiking and you see a bear, what happens to the heart rate? Goes up, right? So we'll see this a lot where the one division of the autonomic nervous system is going in one direction, the other division of the autonomic nervous system is causing that effect of that tissue or organ to go in the opposite direction. All right, so let's talk about some functional differences. For the parasympathetic, what gets increased, right? So here, everything is involved with resting and digesting, right? So what are some things that are going to be increased? Well, not surprisingly, digestive activity, saliva production, and also blood flow to visceral organs, such as the intestines. Why might blood flow to intestines be elevated? Digestion, right? So in order to, take nutrients from the lumen of the intestine, they get absorbed through the intestinal epithelium. They have to get routed to that highway system to be distributed. Generally, it goes to the liver first, directly after digestion. But in order to get that highway system is the blood vessels, right? The blood, right? And in order to increase the capacity to do that, we have increased blood flow to a lot of these visceral organs, including the intestines. All right. Also, urination and defecation are elevated. So here, if we increase digestive ability, we're increasing motility and also absorption rate. So not surprisingly, we're increasing urine formation and then also generation of the fecal matter in the end. Now, if you remember from looking at cranial nerves, the major cranial nerve is the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10. And if you remember that cranial nerve, the reason it's so important is because it innervates so many viscera, right? So here, it's innervating parts of the digestive tract. It's also innervating the heart. It's innervating also the throat region and also other structures of the viscera. So here, the major parasympathetic nerve is the vagus nerve. So it's sending out a major parasympathetic impulse to control a lot of the abdominal, pelvic, and also thoracic when we talk about the lungs, right? Structures, organs, and tissues. So vagus nerve is a major parasympathetic nerve that gets activated to control a lot of these things. All right? Now here, when you're resting and digesting, what gets constricted? So do you need a lot of airflow to your lungs if you're resting and digesting? No. So what happens to the diameter of bronchioles? They shrink. Okay? Now if you're out hiking and you see a bear, right? Your heart rate goes up. And then what happens to the diameter of those bronchioles? They're going to also increase to get more air, right? So here, what gets constricted are the bronchioles. Now, if you're resting and digesting, all right, so pupils also are going to be constricted. Okay? So what's getting decreased? Well, we've talked about a few of these already. So here, breathing rate's going down, heart rate and blood pressure go down. Okay? So blood flow, basically with parasympathetic, the blood flow kind of gets redirected to the viscera from the skeletal muscle. Now, it's the opposite when we talk about sympathetic. You're out and you see a bear, right? You want to have as much blood flow to skeletal muscle as possible, right, to potentially escape. Right? Breathing rate goes down. We talked about that. Now, the other things, if you're resting and digesting, metabolic rate's going down, blood glucose is going down. So here, blood glucose is going down. Good thing to do for our bodies would be to store it in some molecule. So what's the major molecule that we store blood glucose as? So the polymer. So here, glycogen, right? Where is that made? So where's the major organ that makes the glycogen? It is the liver. Yeah, so the liver. So a little bit of skeletal muscle is also going to be able to store some glycogen for the when the major organs is the liver. So here, resting and digesting, you can kind of think about it as trying to absorb things and store them, right, for later use when your body really needs them, right? So you're storing excess amounts of molecules that have energy in them. Any questions on any of these? Do they make sense to folks? Right? Because the next one we're going to look at is a sympathetic, and like you guys probably can guess already, it's going to be basically opposite of what we're seeing here. Right? So here, resting and digesting, and if we take a look at the sympathetic division, right? Let's just see if we can list some things off as being increased, right? So what's going to increase in the sympathetic? Blood flow, skeletal muscle, absolutely. What's some other things we're going to see? So what about heart rate? Elevated, yep. All right, what about bronchioles? Are they going to dilate or constrict? Dilate, absolutely. Right? What about pupils? Dilate. So one of the ways to think about that is that if you're out, say, twilight, and you are hiking and you see a bear, one of the things you want to do is try to find an escape route. What's going to help you do that? Well, letting more light in so you can see better is going to help you do that. So dilate the pupils. Okay? All right? So what about blood glucose here? Yeah, it should be elevated, right? You're increasing blood flow to skeletal muscle. You're increasing heart rate. Both of those are big users of particularly glucose metabolically, right? So that also makes sense with looking at the bronchioles being dilated, because we know aerobic respiration makes a lot of ATP that's really important for skeletal and also cardiac muscles to contract. But in addition to glucose, you need oxygen, right? You need oxygen for that aerobic respiration. So not surprisingly, bronchial dilation, increased glucose, and then what's happening to glycogen? Are we making more glycogen or are we breaking it down? Breaking it down, absolutely, right? So we stored the glycogen when we were in the resting digesting phase, and now we're going to tap into that storage, that resource, when we need it. All right, so I think we hit a lot of these guys, right? So heart rate and blood pressure go up, breathing rate, right, goes up. And bronchioles are also going to be dilated. Blood flow to skeletal muscles goes up. Heart and brain also gets increased blood flow. We know all three of those are huge metabolic users. They do a lot of aerobic respiration, right? And remember, anytime we have aerobic respiration, the two things you need to drive it are glucose and oxygen, right? So here, glycogen's being broke down. We also get sweat production, right? That's elevated. All right, what goes down? What goes down? So what about blood flow to visceral organs? That should be down, absolutely. So all these digestion activity or digestion-related strategies, so saliva production should go down, right? See, we talked about that. Urination and defecation generally goes down. So get your question in just a second. So here, if anyone goes out, does running or does sports where you, activate part of the sympathetic nervous system, after a while, your mouth kind of feels a little bit dry, and you get kind of thicker saliva. One of the reasons for that is that really this parasympathetic is being shut down, and the sympathetic is slightly activated. And when the sympathetic gets slightly activated, you generate a thicker type of saliva. It mixes with some of the mucus. Mucus production goes up slightly. All right? Sorry, go ahead, Ray.
So for given experience investigation, knowing the situations that people have, for the military, it's not uncommon for people to
Yeah, so here there's another part of these responses go toward the limbic system. So the limbic system's involved with emotional response. So, in stressful situations, people can urinate. And the reason is because that emotional response is sending a stimulus. It's taking over or overriding, this stimulus. Yeah. So, and we're really oversimplifying this network, here, but the limbic system does a lot of crosstalk with these systems. And if you guys are really interested, I did post the links to Nova documentary, Secrets of the Mind, which is really fascinating. It includes a section on blind sight, where, individuals are, blind, but they can tell whether something's moving up, down, left, right. And so I posted that up on our Blackboard space as well as an accompanying website for you guys to take a look at. And so there's interesting things in there, all sorts of, interesting syndromes and so forth, beyond what we talked about. All right? Okay, so what gets dilated? So not surprisingly, pupils and bronchioles, right? This goes with everything else we kind of talked about, right? This is all about, getting out of a sticky situation, or if we're, feeling stressed, right? These are all symptoms that we associate with being stressed. These are the opposite of when we are relaxed. All right, so here's our somatic efferent pathway. So efferent means that it's coming from the central nervous system. And somatic means the effector in this case, right? The effector is skeletal muscle, right? Somatic, you should always associate with skeletal muscle. And so if this was a reflex arc, right, one example would be like the patellar tendon reflex, right? And so remember, if our effector skeletal muscle, we had this neuron, which we called a motor neuron. It had its cell body located way in here in the spinal cord. And here that cell body projected its axon out of the spinal cord, out of the CNS, all the way along to its target, to its skeletal muscle, right? Notice here we had just one single neuron going from the spinal cord all the way to the effector. We're not going to see that in the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So this is our motor neuron. And if we look at the autonomic nervous system, what we see is to get to our effector, there's generally going to be two neurons to get to our effector. So that's one of the differences between the autonomic versus the somatic nervous system. Now, if we take a look at this, in order for one neuron to talk to another neuron, we have to have a synapse, right? For neurotransmission, we have a synapse. And if we have a synapse, that means that there's the cell body and the dendrites for a neuron, which means that this is going to be mostly what? Gray or white matter? Gray matter, right? And so here we can say that this is before that synapse. So we can say that this neuron here is a presynaptic neuron, right? That makes sense to folks? Everybody with me? Okay. It has its cell body. Where? In the CNS or the PNS? CNS, in the spinal cord, right? It comes out, and then it's going to pass on information to the next neuron. So we can call this second neuron a postsynaptic neuron, right? Okay. A postsynaptic neuron. Now, here where we have the synapses, remember where we had clusters of gray matter or clusters of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system? We called that ganglia, right? Plural, or ganglion singular. So we can also call these neurons, this one could be the pre-ganglionic neuron, right? And this one could be the post-ganglionic neuron. Okay, so when we talk about autonomic nervous system, we can talk about the presynaptic and postsynaptic, but we can also say preganglionic, postganglionic neuron. Generally, we call them the preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, but you should remember that it's really the separation of those two is just a synapse. In order for the presynaptic or preganglionic neuron to communicate with the postganglionic neuron, it does that through what type of chemical? What was the classification in order for neurons to communicate with each other? So neurotransmitters, right? So in order for this preganglionic neuron to send its message on to the postganglionic neuron, we're going to have a neurotransmitter to relay that message across the synapse. All right, so here, difference between somatic versus autonomic is that somatic, we had a single neuron spanning the distance from the central nervous system, the spinal cord, to the effector. For the autonomic nervous system, right, we get two neurons to do that. Okay. So if we take a look at these receptors, let's take a look first at this somatic nervous system up here, right? So what neurotransmitter was released from the axon terminus of a motor neuron? So which one? Acetylcholine, right? ACH. Okay? Now ACH at the somatic, in the somatic nervous system, right, that was released at that neuromuscular junction, was that excitatory or inhibitory for the somatic motor neuron? Excitatory, absolutely. Okay? All right? So there with the somatic nervous system, you only had one neurotransmitter to deal with, acetylcholine, right? If you look at the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, you look at the neurotransmitter between the preganglionic, postganglionic neurons, and also what's being released from the postganglionic neurons. If you look at all these, what's the most common neurotransmitter you're seeing in there? Still acetylcholine, right? Still acetylcholine. So here, with the autonomic nervous system, it's still acetylcholine. If you look between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons here, between whether it's the sympathetic or parasympathetic, what neurotransmitter are we seeing do that communication between the pre- and postganglionic neurons? Still acetylcholine, right? For the parasympathetic, what neurotransmitter is being released from that postganglionic neuron? Acetylcholine, okay? The only exception to acetylcholine in this system is when we take a look at the postganglionic neuron, right, of that sympathetic nervous system, right? So by default, remember it's acetylcholine except in the sympathetic nervous system at that final neuron, right? Or that final effector, and we'll talk about this guy, right? The adrenal medulla, right? Part of the adrenal gland. All right? So here, I know that seems like a lot's going on, but all this is saying is that it's these the neurotransmitter being used for communication is acetylcholine, except for the sympathetic division when we're actually sending the information out to the effector. Right? Okay. So by default, you should think acetylcholine. All this is cholinergic neurotransmission. All right. Everybody with me on that? Any questions? So this whole communication is set up using acetylcholine. So if we were to dissect out the ganglia here of the autonomic nervous system, what type of neurotransmitter would we most likely find here? Acetylcholine, right? Okay. If we were to isolate the neurotransmitter vesicles in that preganglionic neuron or that axon terminus, it's going to have acetylcholine. Now, if we grab the axon terminus, okay, from a postganglionic neuron, from the autonomic nervous system in the heart, okay, and we found it was releasing epinephrine, norepinephrine, which division of the autonomic nervous system is that postganglionic neuron from? Sympathetic, right? If it was releasing acetylcholine, which division would it be? Parasympathetic, right? Okay. So this is a little bit on the, we're greatly simplifying what's going on, you know, but this holds true most of the time. All right? Okay. All right. So when you get, when you have some sort of emergency, right? Your heart rate goes up, right? You're vigilant, hypervigilant, you're focused, right? And then after you escape the bear, does your body automatically go back down to when you're resting and digesting? No, your heart rate stays elevated for a little bit of time. So let's talk a little bit about one of the reasons why this is going to happen, right? So it's inactivated more slowly than acetylcholine. So if you remember, how was acetylcholine inactivated? How was acetylcholine removed from the synapse? Yeah, acetylcholinesterase. We had an enzyme that chemically broke it down fairly quickly, right? If you look at epinephrine, norepinephrine, that gets released from the postganglionic neurons, right? So it turns out some of that epinephrine, norepinephrine from the adrenal gland, release it into the bloodstream. So if it gets released in the bloodstream, it's going everywhere, right? So it's not just a localized response, it's going everywhere, which means it's going to take a time for your body to be able to remove all of that epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? One of the other things is that for some of the, for all of the epinephrine, norepinephrine, they use a second messenger system. That's not true for the parasympathetic, although I will say some of the parasympathetic does use second messenger systems. But if you remember a second messenger system, indirect system, right, involves what receptor as an example? So remember, if I ask you a receptor, what's the most common one that we're going to talk about? So it's not the acetylcholine. So a receptor that uses a second messenger system. What's a second messenger? What's an example of it? Cyclic AMP. And what receptor system was being used there? GPCR. If I asked you almost exclusively, you know, about receptors, if you say GPCR, you're probably right. Right? They're used over and over again. So here, with epinephrine, norepinephrine, they use GPCRs, which means that you get a neurotransmitter binding to them, and second messengers, one of the things they do is they amplify the signal within the cell, right? So for a neurotransmitter binding to a receptor, we make a whole bunch of cyclic AMP in the cell, right? Remember cyclic AMP, second messengers in general, but cyclic AMP we'll stick with as an example. they do a lot of things in the cell. They'll turn genes on, they'll turn them off, they'll turn proteins on, they'll turn them off, right? Which means it takes a lot of time to undo all the turning on and turning off of genes and proteins, right? So it takes time for that to be reset. So one of the reasons that, we stay a little bit elevated after a sympathetic nervous system activation is because it takes more time to reset that system because it's a second messenger system that has this ripple effect through the cell that needs to be reset. So that whole network changes. In order to change that network back to what it was before the activation, it takes time to do that, right? So this is the one we talked about already. It gets released in the blood, and it stays there until it gets destroyed by the liver, right? And so this is another reason why it takes time to come down from a sympathetic nervous system activation, all right? Okay, so this will be a last thing we talk about with looking at systemic and localized effects between parasympathetic and sympathetic, and we'll take a break. So here, one of the differences is that sympathetic, if that epinephrine, norepinephrine gets released in the bloodstream, is that fairly localized? No, it's distributed everywhere, right? So sympathetic activation is much more systemic. It's huge, right? As where the parasympathetic is much more localized, focused. Okay? So much more localized and focused. Right? So sympathetic effects are going to be body-wide, systemic, affect a lot of multiple organs in a short period of time, right? And so here, that's one of the major reasons that we need time to come down from sympathetic system activation. Parasympathetic, right? So acetylcholine is released at the site where the target effector is, and then it can be broken down by acetylcholinesterase, right? So it's fairly short-lived and fairly well localized compared to the sympathetic. Everybody with me on that? So on a comfort level, people feel fairly comfortable with differences between sympathetic, parasympathetic. All right, so we'll continue our discussion here. So we only have a little bit left to talk about. So we've, up to this point, talked about some functional or physiological differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic, and as well as some structural differences like preganglionic, postganglionic neurons, as well as the neurotransmitters. We're going to dig into a little bit more of some anatomical differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic now. All right? So up to this point, we've talked mostly about functional physiological differences. Now, one of the anatomical differences is that the nerve outflow from the CNS for parasympathetic is what we call craniosacral, meaning that they're coming out of the cranial region as also the sacral region. So you might guess that, all right, well, where is the sympathetic? Well, it comes out of the thoracolumbar region, thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Hopefully this makes a little bit of sense to you, because what was the major cranial nerve for that gets activated when the sympathetic nervous system? The vagus nerve, right? And the vagus nerve is coming out of, not surprisingly, the brainstem, the cranial region. So if you remember that the vagus nerve is a major parasympathetic cranial nerve, you could also remember that, which to be able to distinguish, if you couldn't remember which was craniosacral versus thoracolumbar for sympathetic, parasympathetic, if you remember the vagus nerve is coming out of the cranium, then you can remember that the parasympathetic is craniosacral. Okay? The sympathetic is going to be thoracolumbar or thoracic and lumbar region of the spinal cord. All right? So here, the other difference is that, remember we had two neurons to span the distance from the central nervous system to the effector for the autonomic nervous system, right? Okay. So here, Remember, we had a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron. For the parasympathetic, that preganglionic neuron is fairly long, which means that the ganglia are going to be, what, close to the effector or close to the spinal cord? Which one do you think? Close to the effector, not the central nervous system. So here, the preganglionic neurons make it almost all the way to their target, their effector, right? That means that the postganglionic neurons are, what, long or short, do you think? Short. So here, the other difference that we'll see is that for the parasympathetic, they have long preganglionic neurons, but short postganglionic neurons. And
so is that where it's talking about the cardiac plexus?
Yeah, plex. Yeah, so the word plexus just means network. So it's kind of this, interchange. So if you've seen those really complicated interchanges for highways, like in LA, right? That's what plexuses are. They're kind of this grouping of ganglia, where you have neurons communicating with other neurons. Generally, you're going to see these plexuses at points where they're innervating a lot of target structures that are kind of close together, where there's a narrowing, a funneling going on, right? So if you remember, for some of the peripheral nerves, we had the brachial plexus, for instance, right? The reason it's a plexus is because it's kind of bunched together as a network, because it has to go through your shoulder, kind of a squeeze point, right, to get through your arm, right? Similar things happening here. So here we have plexuses, right? And you don't necessarily have to know these, but plexuses that are innervating structures that are kind of anatomically in the same geographical area, like heart and lungs, for instance. Stomach, spleen, pancreas, large intestine, small intestine, right? Down here we have a plexus for some of the pelvic structures, the genitals, the bladder, for instance, right? So plexus just means network. So here it's a network of nerves. So if we talk about, a blood flow, you're going to find plexuses for blood flow too, right? It's just a network of blood vessels in that case, all right? Okay, so here the autonomic ganglia are close to their effectors, the targets for the parasympathetic. Major cranial nerves, the big one here is this guy, the vagus nerve, right? So vagus nerve. There's a few other ones. So here, facial nerves involved with salivation and tears. Salivation is also controlled somewhat by the glossopharyngeal nerve. So being able to dilate the pupil, as well as change the lens, which we'll talk about in the special senses, right? All right, it's done by the oculomotor nerve. Right? So here, I would say this is the big one that you want to get a hold of, right? And then take a look at some of these other ones, okay? But vagus nerve is one that you definitely want to be aware of. Now, something called divergence. So think about if you're going from A to B, right? If you are almost all the way to B, there's not too many more options to get to B. You're almost you're almost there already. Right? That's something similar here with what we call divergence. So here, there's less divergence in the sympathetic. Why? Because that preganglionic neuron is long. It almost makes its way all the way to the target, right? And so if it's almost all the way to its target, its destination, there's not too many different ways to get there. Now, if you're just have left A to go to B, you have a lot more options, right? So if you're thinking about traveling, right? So if you just just had stepped out your door, for instance, you're going to be able to have a lot more options to be able to get to your destination, right? And so that's what we're talking about with divergence. There's less divergence here with the parasympathetic, which is one of the reasons why we have a fairly localized control. Okay? And we'll see that that's really the opposite with the sympathetic. All right? So I know this image is fairly busy. Okay? But the point is that starting with the CNS, know that the neurons for the parasympathetic are coming out of the craniosacral region, and that they are long preganglionic but short postganglionic neurons, which means the ganglia are going to be close to the viscera, right? That they are the effectors of. Now it's different than the sympathetic, right? So here, the sympathetic neurons are coming out of the thoracic and lumbar regions. And in contrast to the parasympathetic, the preganglionic neurons here are fairly short. If they're fairly short, that means the ganglia are going to be, not surprisingly, close to where they're coming out of, right? So here, there's a string of ganglia, right, that are close to the spinal cord. So we call these paravertebral ganglia as one of the ways we talk about them, right? It's also, because they're close to each other, they look like a chain or a trunk. So a sympathetic chain or a trunk. So if you harvest a ganglia that's close to an effector, is that more likely to be a sympathetic or a parasympathetic ganglia? Parasympathetic, right? If you harvest a ganglia that's in the thoracic lumbar region, or along the thoracic lumbar region, right, close to the spinal cord, it's more likely to be sympathetic, right? So here, two anatomical differences of where they're coming out from the CNS, and then also preganglionic versus postganglionic neuron length. Okay? Right? So here, once again, though, just to re-emphasize this, right, the neurotransmitter from the preganglionic neuron, whether we're sympathetic or parasympathetic, is still acetylcholine. In general, that neurotransmitter that's coming from the postganglionic neuron is epinephrine, norepinephrine, okay? Right, for the sympathetic nervous system. So this is the only time we see epinephrine, norepinephrine is in that postganglionic neuron from the sympathetic. The rest of the time, it's acetylcholine. Okay? Now, I'm going to talk about, the dual nature of the viscera or the effectors. A lot of them, if you took a look at, the previous two slides, you'll notice that not only do you see innervation of a lot of this viscera by the sympathetic nervous system, but if you go back to the parasympathetic, a lot of the same organs are also innervated by the parasympathetic, right? So there's this duality between sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation. Now, I fibbed a little bit to you guys when I was saying that, the central nervous system controls digestion through reflex arcs. Turns out that there's a huge network of neurons that are able to control the digestion. And that network is so extensive that a lot of neuroscientists call it the second brain. And there's reflex arcs that help us with moving food through our digestive tract that don't even go to the central nervous system. So they stay in this plexus here, this enteric nervous system, right? And the control over this enteric nervous system can be from the parasympathetic and sympathetic, all right? And so here we have neural networks in our GI tract. Some of the visceral reflexes, and they can be coordinated locally, but the CNS can superimpose some control over it. Okay? So it's kind of like having a motor and then just directing the motor, in the direction that it wants to go. Okay? And then we can have, turning up and turning down that motor a bit. All right? So here, parasympathetic, is that going to promote movement or digestion? Yes. Right? So here, increases contraction, release of enzymes and digestive chemicals, be able to break things down. So here, sympathetic, though, is going to be doing the opposite. It's me putting the brakes on this, right? So we're decreasing contraction and release of digestive chemicals, right? So here, under normal circumstances, generally a lot of these viscera have the dominant tone is going to be parasympathetic, right? Okay, so when we talk about tone, it's about what's dominant most of the time, sympathetic or parasympathetic, okay? All right, so here, for the viscera. So here, dual innervation. In this case, there's two different muscles innervated. One of those muscles constricts the pupils. The other muscle, when it gets activated, okay, dilates the pupil. So here, not surprisingly, okay, so here, the sympathetic innervates the dilator muscle, and the parasympathetic's going to be innervating the constrictor muscle. Right? So here, what we see is two separate effectors, right, that have opposite effects. Right? So they antagonize each other. Now, we also can have antagonistic effects, but we have the same effector for the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons. And we'll talk more about this when you get to cardiovascular. But example, that's heart rate, right? So here, the dominant tone on the heart is generally going to be parasympathetic. If you cut off that parasympathetic innervation right now to you guys, without activating the sympathetic nervous system, your heart rate goes up. Without activating the sympathetic nervous system. So this parasympathetic is constantly putting a little bit of the brakes on your heart rate. Constantly. Right? And so here, that same cardiac muscle tissue that is involved with controlling heart rate, okay, if you go out and you see a bear, right, the sympathetic becomes the more dominant stimulus on that tissue, right? Sympathetic gets shut down. Sympathetic promotes increased heart rate, all right? Okay. So I just talked about this. This is just putting it in words. Sympathetic is going to be input to dilator muscles, parasympathetic to constrictor, all right, muscles. Okay. Two separate effectors. With the heart rate, it's the same effector from the two different divisions. Everybody with me on the difference between the two? Dual innervation. One case, the innervation is two separate effectors, the dilator versus constrictor muscle. Okay, two separate muscles. And then for the heart rate, it's the same muscle. It's just which has the dominant effect. Which means that cardiac muscle, does it have only one type of receptor on it? No. It's got to have a receptor for parasympathetic is going to be what? Acetylcholine or epinephrine? Acetylcholine. And then the sympathetic is going to be, so, epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? So that cardiac muscle's got to have two separate receptors. All right. Dual innervation, we talked about opposite effects. Here's a cooperative one, right? So here, two divisions, parasympathetic, sympathetic, and sympathetic cooperate for a final outcome. In this case, orgasm, all right? So parasympathetic, sympathetic. Parasympathetic's involved with vasodilating external genitalia. So here, parasympathetic is involved with, say, erection. Sympathetic's involved with ejaculation, all right? So why do I have a picture of a gun here? Well, parasympathetic's involved with pointing. Sympathetic's involved with shooting. All right, so point and shoot. Right, P and S, parasympathetic, sympathetic. Right, both for an ultimate outcome. Right, the final outcome there. Okay. Parasympathetic, sympathetic, cooperating together for a final goal. That's different than what we just looked at, where the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and sympathetic were antagonistic to each other. Now, you can have different effects on an effector from just one of the systems. So it turns out, some of the blood vessels are tonically somewhat having sympathetic tone to them. Means that the sympathetic has some firing rate. It releases some epinephrine, norepinephrine to keep those blood vessels somewhat constricted. So the blood muscles in the blood vessel walls are somewhat constricted or contracted. If that firing rate increases, sympathetic innervation increases, or sympathetic frequency of action potentials, I should say, increases, right? Then that muscles in the muscle cell wall, or in the blood vessel cell wall, are going to constrict or contract, which means that the blood vessel is going to constrict, right? Okay. Now, if that frequency slows down, then those muscles in that blood vessel wall aren't going to contract as much, which means what's going to happen to the diameter? It's going to get larger, right? So here we can control the diameter of certain blood vessels just based upon increasing or decreasing the sympathetic frequency of firing. Because if we increase frequency, we increase neurotransmitter release. That's a good correlation. Everybody with me on that? Okay, go ahead, Ray. So remember, to what structures?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, skeletal muscle. So here we could talk about, blood vessels to, say, the viscera. Yep. Good catch. Excellent catch. Yep. Absolutely. Okay. And there's other things that go on. There's other substances that cause blood vessel dilation. Like I said, we're kind of oversimplifying this quite a bit. All right. So last thing before we do a quick review here. So there are certain compounds out there that will mimic the sympathetic nervous system activation, right? So we can talk about substances that mimic it are sympathomimetics. So what are some things that could do that? Well, they could, say, bind to epinephrine, norepinephrine receptors, right? They could kind of mimic the epinephrine, norepinephrine chemical structure. So would that mean that if they bind to the receptor and they activate it, would that be an agonist or an antagonist? Agonist, right? So that's one way. What about substances that maintain or elevate or stimulate release of epinephrine, norepinephrine? Is that going to be a sympathomimetic? Yeah, absolutely, right? So there's several different ways where this can happen. So here there's multiple ways we can increase the epinephrine, norepinephrine receptor, activation. And so phenylephrine and dimetap, right, is an example. There are certain other bronchodilators out there, right, that are involved in this, right? So they're constricting blood vessels and so forth. Well, that's an example. Well, not surprisingly, if we have ways to mimic sympathetic, we also have ways, or there's compounds out there that suppress the sympathetic nervous system. So anything that's a lytic is suppressing. So here, sympatholytics are going to be suppressing a sympathetic nervous system. Why might that be beneficial, right? If someone already has high blood pressure, do you want the sympathetic nervous system to get activated? Well, it's probably not a good thing. And so what do? Well, one of the things that the sympathetic nervous system does, right, when it is getting activated is, what does it do to the heart rate? So it makes it go up. So what if you put a compound that blocks the receptors in the heart from that sympathetic response? So those receptors in the heart are called beta receptors. And so there are certain compounds that will target those receptors of the heart called beta blockers. Not nitroglycerin. That's different. So that'll cause vasodilation in the peripheral blood vessels. So one of the other ways, when we get to the cardiovascular system, so if you have high blood pressure, right, the last thing you want to do is constrict the peripheral blood vessels. In fact, what you want to do is you want to get them larger. Nitroglycerin does that. So it doesn't affect the heart directly. It affects the peripheral blood vessels more. Yeah. So here, sympatholytics reduce hypertension, elevated blood pressure for sustained amounts of time, okay, by making sure the sympathetic nervous system doesn't activate or increase heart rate. So just like what we see here with activating the sympathetic or inhibiting the sympathetic nervous system, not surprisingly, we see the same thing with the parasympathetic. So there's compounds out there that mimic parasympathetic activation, right? So they enhance its activity. So pilocarpine is an example, right? Used to cause dilation of vessels in the eye to relieve glaucoma. Glaucoma is an increase of blood pressure, or increase in, fluid pressure in the eye. In order to relieve that, you increase blood vessels to be able to take that fluid pressure away. All right. Parasympatholytic, okay, inhibiting parasympathetic nervous system. One example is atropine, right? So this can be used in eye exams, for instance, to dilate the eye. All right. Also, one of the effects is to decrease salivation. All right? Okay, so just do a review here. Right? So comparing parasympathetic and sympathetic. All right? So here, I'm not going to write on the wall, but heart rate, okay? What's happening in the heart rate? Going up or down for the parasympathetic? Down. What about sympathetic? Up. Blood pressure going up or down for the parasympathetic? Down. And what about sympathetic? Going up. All right, so now I can start writing on the board. Breathing rate. What do we say? Parasympathetic. Going up or down? All right, so hopefully you guys are seeing a trend. Breathing rate for sympathetic. Going up. Blood glucose. Right? So blood glucose. Is that going up or down with parasympathetic? Down, right? Remember, we're taking that blood glucose and we want to store the excess blood glucose for use later. And so here, we're decreasing blood glucose, which means for glycogen production, is glycogen synthesis going up or down with parasympathetic? It's going up. Yeah, so we're storing more glucose, right? And every time we store glucose, it's generally going to be in the form of glycogen. Blood glucose for sympathetic should be going up, right? So remember, we're increasing blood flow to skeletal muscle, heart, brain. In order to do all the ATP production, we need glucose and oxygen for that, aerobic respiration. Metabolic rate, parasympathetic, resting and digesting. Is that going up or down here? Should be going down. And then what about sympathetic? Yep, going up. Blood to skeletal muscle, up or down? Down. And then here, blood to skeletal muscle for sympathetic should be going up. Sweat production for parasympathetic going down. And then sweat production for sympathetic. So hopefully you guys are seeing a trend here. Release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. So kind of down or not at all. Release of epinephrine, norepinephrine for sympathetic, definitely going up, right? Pupils, and we'll say here pupil diameter, right? Pupil diameter, is it increase or decrease for parasympathetic? Decrease, right? Sympathetic, that diameter increases. Bronchioles, so we'll talk about bronchial diameter. Bronchial diameter, so here, parasympathetic should go down, right? Here, it should go up. Cranial nerve number 10, vagus nerve activation. It goes up for the parasympathetic. What about the sympathetic? Should be going down, right? Digestion. So going up for the parasympathetic and here for the sympathetic should be going down. And then saliva production should be going up. And then here for the sympathetic going down. Let's see, last one, urination and defecation, parasympathetic, should be going up, and then here it should be going down. All right? Okay? Hopefully these, you can group these together, right? And they make sense, system-wide. Okay? Any questions? All right. So like I said, for those that want to go down further rabbit holes, I have some slides for you guys. All right? Okay. So, we'll be going over the exam and lab on Wednesday. And if you guys want to see it before then, just stop by my office, and happy to have you guys take a look at them. All right? Okay. All right. So be safe out there, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday.